Hey there, kiddos. We now reach the Battle of Vathar Crossing, which is the fourth battle in the Chain of Dogs, but the third battle in my series. It has been 6 long months since Coltaine and the 7th Army left Hisar. 6 months without relief, reinforcement, or resupply. 6 months of pain, trauma, and death. Coltaine has been pushing everyone beyond their limits, and it still isn't nearly enough. His plan of arriving at the ford of Vathar River 2 days before his enemy Korbolo Dom has fallen to ruin as nearly 30 companies of the Whirlwind Army cavalry are seen racing for the ford. Coltaine quickly sends the remaining 800 Foolish Dog warriors ahead to secure the ford, and the Whirlwind forces end up making an encampment to the west. I always had trouble visualizing this battle when I was reading it. It has great descriptions and action, but for some reason it just never really clicked in a way that I was really satisfied with. Nowadays, after having read it probably 30 times at this point, I feel like I've got a pretty good grasp on it. So hopefully this video will help anybody who is having trouble visualizing it or just basically just wants to see a little more information about it, because it's really a very interesting battle. First and foremost, let's discuss the combatants in order to set the stage. Commanding the Malazans is Coltaine, leader of the Wiccans and the Fist of the Malazan 7th Army. Because of the last 2 brutal battles, the Malazan forces have been severely reduced. We know for sure there are only about 800 Foolish Dog warriors left, and the Weasel clan is likely similarly mauled. Unfortunately, there aren't that many hard numbers besides these. Of the 3 Wiccan warlocks left, only Sormo Anath is available for battle, as Nil and Nether are still out of commission after Gelor Ridge. Commanding the Whirlwind Army is the Malazan renegade Korbolo Dom, a traitor and a very competent tactician, even while he is a bit ruthless. Korbolo is bringing a fresh army to the field, which includes the Malazan troops he convinced to betray with him, which was about half his garrison. In addition to his large army, he is also reinforced by the remnant troops that Camistrilo was able to gather. The last big advantage is that the Warrens are no longer being contested, so the Whirlwind mages now have access to their magic again. Next up is the map and geography. The Vathar is a slow-moving river within a rocky gorge. The distance between the edges of the gorge are wide enough that a bridge is unfeasible, especially when there's a ford nearby, but still close enough to span the distance on ropes. The crossing itself takes place at a low point, where a sloping moraine leads down to the river. So, moraines are created from glacial deposited stone or silts, and given the age, the slope wouldn't be too loose anymore, so there won't be a repeat of the terrible terrain of Gelor Ridge. The Vathar River itself runs from the Jenna Mountains to the west and flows all the way down to the Dojal-Hating Sea to the east. Near the crossing, there are large cedar trees on both the north and south side of the river. However, these dwindle as you continue east towards the sea, until there are no trees on the north and even the south is sparsely covered. Additionally, at the crossing, everything is covered in millions of yellow butterflies who are on migration, including the river itself is clogged with a layer of these dead butterflies. The advance party of Foolish Dog warriors were accompanied by Diker, and once they arrived at the ford, they began building pickets and entrenchments. The expectation was that the Wiccans would have to defend the ford against the Whirlwind cavalry that outnumbered them 3-1. And to try and hold out until Coltaine and the 7th arrived. However, Korbolo Dom's cavalry didn't contest the ford. Instead, they established a camp to the west of the ford and began cutting down trees. The rest of Dom's troops also beat Coltaine to the ford, and instead of easily taking out the entrenched Wiccans, Dom just had his army encircle them, but still leave a path open for Coltaine to access the ford. It ends up taking 2 more hours for the rest of the Malazan 7th to arrive, and in the meantime, Korbolo Dom has the trees surrounding the clearing cut down, opening out the field. Coltaine and the 7th join the Foolish Dog warriors at the crossing and begin setting up a camp in the evening. Several things occur during this time. Gessler and the Solanda had been discovered by Diker and the Wiccans near the ford. After being updated, they traveled west, upriver, and discovered that several hundred archers had crossed to the southern shore using ropes. The whirlwind mages use magic to block attempts at spying on their camps. Coltaine loads up as many wounded and Wiccan youths onto the Solanda as possible. Korbolo Dom sends an emissary over to Coltaine with the message of free passage to the refugees. Now, Korbolo Dom's actions here are meant to be a bit confusing to the reader. He's fairly mysterious, as we haven't seen him yet, but we know that he is a traitor and ruthless. His offer should be a big cause for concern, which is why Coltaine refuses it. We also know that Korbolo Dom is at least a decent tactician, so it's safe to assume that any goodwill would be a trap. So, why is Korbolo Dom taking these bizarre actions? Well, Mr. Korbolo is what is commonly referred to as a petty bitch. He has a very huge ego, so when Coltaine was promoted to the Fist of the 7th Army instead of him, the battle became very personal. Korbolo doesn't want to just beat Coltaine, he wants to utterly destroy and humiliate him. In addition to being overly confident, this will tend to put a commander in a position to easily make mistakes. Unfortunately for Coltaine, however, Korbolo is definitely skilled and has had time to come up with a few devious plans, while also outnumbering the Malazans by a lot. Okay, remember that emissary that Korbolo had sent over? Well, he also sent a second one to the refugee nobles. I've mostly avoided discussing the nobles so far, since they really suck, but I guess I need to explain a bit about them now. The nobles among the refugees have been a constant pain in Coltaine's side during the entire chain of dogs. They created their own noble council and have used it to try making demands, keep track of perceived wrongs, and maintain a fake semblance of power and authority. This wouldn't be so bad if the council actually looked out for other refugees, but every step of the way, the council is just used for selfish purposes of noble greed. A few examples are: maintained ownership of their slaves and continued to beat them, tried gaining more rations just for the nobles, wanted protection only for the nobles, Captain Solmar using his position as a noble and captain to push the desires of the Council of Nobles, especially those of Nethpara and Polyak, spend the entire time continually bitching about their circumstances. So now everyone remembers how shitty the nobles are, and so when the second emissary shows up, of course they just blindly accept it. This will of course spring the trap that Dom has prepared. To allow some benefit of the doubt, the noble named Tumlit is pretty alright. He actually warns Coltaine of the treachery, and there's also the argument to be made that the nobles are just trying to maintain appearances in order to feel some small sense of normalcy and remain sane during the horrors of the chain. This topic is even discussed among the upper command, and I do empathize since conditions are absolutely horrible, but it doesn't give them the right to act as horribly as they do. Okay, we've now discussed all the major players and the map, so let's get to the actual troop placements. Closest to the crossing are the nobles and their wagons, as well as the refugees. Surrounding them are the Malazan troops, likely with the 7th Infantry manning pickets and the Wiccan cavalry just inside of them. Korbolo's troops, of course, have the Malazans surrounded. He also has an encampment to the west, which has been felling trees in order to make into some floating bridges, but the Malazans are unaware of this. Additionally, about 300 archers have crossed the river to the west, and now they wait in the forest beyond the crossing. This is about as close as I can get, since there isn't a lot of information listed about Korbolo's general troops. The trap that Korbolo has set up is designed to kill the refugees, and thus cause Coltaine to utterly fail in his main mission. It's a horrible way to use innocent lives to try belittling Coltaine before defeating him on the battlefield. The battle begins about an hour before dawn, when the nobles get all the refugees riled up and start a push for the river crossing. With the nobles' carriages leading the way, there is no way for the Malazans to stop the huge mass of 45,000 people. When Coltaine is informed of this, he understands that Korbolo's trap is being sprung, and he gives out commands to his captains and war leaders. 12 Wiccan horse warriors lead the carriages and the refugees in order to provide at least some direction to the crossing. The sappers, with marines, infiltrate the mass and begin crossing as well. The 7th prepares to hold against enemy contact, and the Wiccans prepare a surprise of their own. Basically, all available soldiers ready their weapons, even those standing by as a fallback point, clearly showing Coltaine is preparing for the need to maintain a fighting withdrawal. As the refugees make it about halfway across the ford, there are sounds of combat from the rear guard as Dom's troops close on the 7th Army. Let's focus on the south side of the river first, since we have more details about it. Right as the carriages reach the shore, arrows rain down on the crossing, killing the Wiccan horse warriors and the oxen pulling the carriages. This blocks up the ford, trapping a large majority of the refugees in the river. A floating bridge appears from both upstream and downstream, being pulled by rope crews on the shoreline. Arrows begin raining down onto the civilians from both bridges and from the woods on the southern shore as a sheer helpless panic rises among their screams. The sappers push several of the lead carriages out to make a crescent defensive formation on the shore, and have used long ropes in order to pull their troops through the panicked mob. Once they are grouped up, the remaining sappers, marines, and Wiccans on this side charge into the forest to confront the whirlwind forces that are there. With there being at least 3 companies of archers and likely some auxiliary protection, they heavily outnumber the Malazans. Unfortunately, this fight is very desperate. There won't be any help coming, and if the forest isn't cleared, the entire battle is lost. Arrow fire on the crossing dies down a bit as the sappers unleash mayhem on the archers, and we all know how insane they are. The floating bridges are still closing on the civilians. The archers on the bridges have exhausted their arrow supply, but sadly there are plenty of pikemen loaded onto the platforms. Refugees that had been spreading out along the southern shore surge upstream in panic and rage to attack the rope crew, literally tearing them to pieces. Visceral carnage erupts as the pikemen come within range to deliver slaughter, lashing out wildly. At this point, however, the refugees have been driven near mad with helpless panic, and they grab at the slashing weapons with their bare hands. The crowds swarm the pikemen, surging up onto the bridge, clawing through their killers until the bridge collapses under the added weight. A wave of sorcery lashes out at the downstream bridge, taking out many soldiers on it as Sormo Inoth joined in the crossing. Just after this, 4 arrows puncture his body, and unfortunately one hits him in the neck, which prevents him from healing the wounds. As a result, he falls from his horse into the water and vanishes from sight. A hush comes to the assembled refugees and soldiers alike as butterflies swarm his dying body until there is an enormous mound of them. The butterflies are taking his soul instead of crows, which means his spirit will not be reborn among his people. This silence is ended by Wiccan archers who take aim and kill all the remaining soldiers on the downstream bridge to avenge the warlock. In the southern woods, a scant 30 sappers and a handful of marines are retreating. Along with this, arrow fire is intensifying from the woods. Without the southern shore being cleared of the whirlwind's forces, the crossing won't be able to continue in earnest, and the trap will remain in place. Diker yells to the refugees, pointing out the enemies in the woods, and he is met with a bestial roar as the unarmed mob rushes forward to unleash hell. This will end up clearing the southern side of the crossing. However, we only experience this battle through the point of view of Diker, and at this point he loses consciousness while attacking the shitty noble Nethpara. Because of this, we don't know what really occurs on the northern front of the battle besides a few glimpses. The few things we know are that sounds of battle are heard when the lead elements of the refugees are about halfway across the river, meaning contact has been made by Korbolo's forces. There are 3 blocks of infantry seen heading towards the crossing to instill order, and Weasel Clan warriors are seen riding back into the clearing from the western woods, shouting triumphantly. These last 2 occurred just before Diker loses consciousness, thus they happen as the southern shore is being cleared of the whirlwind forces. Everything besides these 3 points are my own inference and may not be what actually occurred, though hopefully it isn't too outlandish. So after the refugees passed, the flanking infantry readied their weapons, which means guaranteed the troops on the perimeter also ready themselves. The likely position is to have the 7th Infantry located on the defensive formations, with the Wiccan Cavalry providing a mobile relief and missile support to help keep the line from buckling. This is similar to how we've seen the defensive fighting in other battles like Sekala Crossing. The exception, of course, is the Weasel Clan, who we know was sent out to the west on a sortie. They could have been attacking the encampment to the west, but I believe that they circle around to hit Korbolo's troops from behind in order to cause some relief for the 7th Infantry. Why do I think this happens? Well, based on the losses from the 7th, we know that the fighting here has to be brutal and desperate. And yet, when the Weasel Clan returns to the crossing, they are yelling triumphantly, and we also see 3 blocks of infantry coming down to the crossing to help instill order. The only way I see infantry getting pulled from the front line is if the enemy was pushed back for a bit, offering a little breather. Either way, the infantry shows up to the ford, the noble carriages are removed, unblocking the crossing, and with the slaughter stopped, the refugees complete the crossing. Even with the crossing being clear, it would be a fighting withdrawal while the rest of the non-combatants cross, before the cavalry and infantry can cross. Once all of the Malazans are on the south side of the river, Korbolo Dom no longer engages, since he is content to wait for another favorable battle location. Though, once the trap was turned in the Malazans' favor, he may have withdrawn his troops and allowed the crossing to complete, but we can't really know for sure. This is really the first time that Coltaine is caught in a situation where he can't maintain absolute control of the battlefield, and the staggering losses are the result of that. Thankfully, the Malazans were able to properly disengage from the battle and cross the Vathar River to continue the journey south. The next leg of the chain of dogs is referred to as the Dry March across an Odan with little access to water, being lazily pursued by Korbolo Dom, and being continually attacked by the 2 tribes calling this Odan their home. Overall, the losses for this battle are massive. 20,000 refugees are dead. 700 infantry are killed or injured. The Foolish Dog clan only have about 500 able-bodied warriors remaining, with similar numbers among the other 2 clans. And unfortunately, the sappers are reduced down to about a dozen soldiers, with 20-ish marines remaining. The Malazans survive, but this is a definite loss for them, and it feels like a tipping point is quickly approaching. Join me next time, where I'll discuss the Battle of Sanamon, where the Malazans get cut off, and Korbolo Dom once again moves against Coltaine. Thank you for watching the video. Hopefully you found something to enjoy in there and wasn't too boring. Let me know if there's any improvements you think of. I know from the last video I added a combatant section to try to get a little bit of more info between the 2 leaders and who's really doing the fighting. Previously, I posted a video on the Wiccans to try to get a little bit more information for visualizing who the 3 Wiccan clans are, featuring some wonderful art by Simi of Doom. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Have a good day.